Uh,
Hello.
uh,
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm good. Just waking up. What time is it there?
It's 9 in the evening.
Oh, so 12-hour difference at 9 p.m. 9
Yeah,
a.m. here. Yeah.
yeah. Cool, cool, cool. So how's everything?
I'm good. I was at a conference speaking, right? So that was yesterday. And then so I'm just in the hotel right now. And there's not much really going on today. I fly back out to Connecticut today. So I
Oh,
go back
cool.
home.
When is your flight?
Flight isn't until 5 p.m. tonight.
Oh, you got plenty of times.
Plenty of time. Plenty of time.
So, like, first of all, can you introduce yourself for the coaches?
Sure.
Oh,
I am, my name is Brijesh Patel. I am an associate athletic director at Quinnipiac University. I also have my own website consulting business that I like to do as well too. CoachBPatel.com. I've been in the performance industry for well over 20 years now. Worked with a number of youth athletes, college athletes, professional athletes. But in the future, what I really like to do is just help coaches get better and help coach coaches. And so that's, I think, is the next forefront of what I'm looking to do as well. I just like to help
cool.
people get better.
That's cool. That's cool. And basically, I heard all the podcasts you did. Yeah, it's cool.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Did you listen to them all?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, first of all, want to talk about fascia training. Your
Okay.
thoughts on fascia? Why do you think we should training fascia?
Okay. So fascia is it's something that I've kind of looked into probably over the last 3 years or so, and it took a little bit more of a deep dive. And the reason why I started to look into it is because I was intrigued by the properties of it and understanding that if it's a part of our body, if it's a part of it's almost like a system, then it's probably something that I should be aware of. And then I started to look to see if it was going to be able to impact the things I did. And so I've taken deep dives through PRI and RPR in those courses, and they kind of touch on fascia. But then when I started to break it out and look at it on its own, I started to realize that it's extremely important to be able to not only understand but appreciate in terms of how you can train a little bit more effectively. Now, when we train, you can't just say oh, I'm going to do a fascia day. I'm going to do, well, this exercise is geared for your fascia. That's not how it works, because it's a tensional component, structural component of our entire body that surrounds everything. So you can't isolate it out. So that's the first and foremost thing to be able to understand. But there are things that you can do that can impact the quality of it and the effectiveness of it, because what it really comes down to is that you have a lot of proprioceptors and spindle cells that are located within your fascia. And every time your fascia starts to stretch, it communicates information back to the central nervous system. And that central nervous system is then going to deliver the right outputs to be able to coordinate smooth and coordinated movements so that you can, move a little bit more efficiently. And that's the way I look at things when it comes to exercise and it comes to athletic development, is everything that we do is movement, right? Everything we're doing is trying to enhance your ability to move much more efficiently. And what we're trying to do is trying to make our athletes to be the most efficient people that they can be so that they can perform their sporting skills harder, faster, and longer.
Cool. So, so go back to training fascia. How exactly should we train fascia?
Well, there's lots of different things you can do. So number one is you can prepare your fascia, right? And so the way we look at that is you can do compression work to it or you can do traction work to it. Why do we want to prepare the fascia? Because we want to make sure that you can remove densifications, we can remove any adhesions, we can move any restrictions, and restrictions are barriers to movement. So like I said before, movement is at the precipice. Movement is everything. And if your fascia is sticky, densified, there's restrictions in it, we're not going to be able to move efficiently, but then more importantly, it's not going to be able to stretch the way we want it to. And if it can't stretch, then the spindle cells, the information being sent back to the central nervous system isn't going to be as efficient as it could be. So then our movement is going to be altered. So that may result in compensations, that may result in any other kind of issues that we may have that are going to be barriers to our movement. So number one, we want to prepare. So a lot of people, strength coaches, I think, like to do compression work, right? So everybody will do foam rolling, grasped and soft tissue work, which is fantastic. It's a great way to align collagen fibers. It's a way to create some inhibition. But the other thing that I don't think a lot of us do, and the thing that I probably implemented the most over the course of the last couple of years, is fascial stretching, which is much more tractional, which is much more tensional in terms of what we're trying to do and impact our fascia. So fascial stretching techniques are a really good way to do that. And so Eldoa, if you're familiar with Eldoa, if anybody's familiar with that, Stretch to Win by the Fredericks also have some really good techniques too. But it's getting you to understand that if you don't think about muscles in isolation, but think of them as in links and chains that extend throughout our entire body. And if the muscles are encased with fascia that doesn't move very well, then our flexibility and our ability to move is going to be somewhat restricted. So when we do a fascial stretch, we're trying to elongate and tension those links in chains so that we can move a little bit more effectively. That's the first step. And then the next thing is we want to load the fascia. We want to get it to be stronger. We want it to be more resilient. But we don't want to do it in just one direction. We want to do in omnidirectional movements. We want to do triplanar movements. We want to be able to load it with different implements, because we want to be able to have, because what happens is when we start to load, fibroblasts are going to get laid within the extracellular matrix, which are going to spit out more collagen fibers, in which we can create a little bit more resiliency and more robustness strands of collagen fiber, which can help protect us more. But we want to make sure that we load through different angles, through different vectors, through different speeds, through different implements, so that we can create a more robust tensional framework for our body. And then the third thing is we want to work on the elastic properties of it, because if you work with athletes, speed kills. Like, we want to make sure that they can become explosive and fast. So that requires that we need to do some elastic type training. So when we do elastic type training, we want to think short, quick, rhythmic type bounces, especially with the lower body and the lower limb. We want them to be much more resilient through their lower leg. We want them to be quick and explosive. So we create some little stiffness through the lower limb fascia, so we can apply, we can be more powerful, we can be faster. So it's not one thing, it's a very multi-stage approach to how we look at things.
So you mentioned like loading the fascia. Does that mean like things like eccentric loading?
Eccentric, isometric, concentric variations. It's a mixture of everything. And it depends on the time of the year. But yeah, like the way I look at loading it is it's a variation. Like, we wanted to emphasize full range of motion strength training. And it's a form of almost loaded stretching, right? And so we want to make sure that we can tension and elongate with load, so that we can stimulating entire fascial links and fascial chains, so we can stimulate those spindle cells. We can also use some exercises to maybe inhibit overactive areas, which can facilitate other areas before we move, so we can improve the quality of movement with our strength training work. And we can use a variety of different implements, not just barbells and dumbbells, but kettlebells, ropes, medicine balls, landmines. We have great technology that we have to access to the Ohm Run. It's optimal human motion. It's a fantastic device. It's an isokinetic accommodating resistance device that I think impacts our fascia like nothing else I've ever seen.
So, when we talk about fascia training, it's basically like the same thing we did, but with like different kind of like approach, or different the way to see training, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, and so it's not like I said before, it's not something that you can just be like, oh, like, yeah, we're going to train our fascia. Like, that doesn't work that way. Like, what you're doing is you're gaining another lens. At least what I did is I gained another lens on how I can view movement. And how I view movement can be impacted, how I may tinker a exercise that we might have done 5 years ago to now might be a little bit different just based on my lens in which I view movement. That's all it is. It's you're gaining another perspective, right? And so if you only know one way of doing things, then you're going to view everything through one way. It's like the toolbox analogy. But if you have different ways of looking at things and you can understand multiple perspectives, now you can figure out better strategies to use for every individual or in every situation that you may encounter. And the only thing that really it's done in terms of how we train is it's forced me to maybe look at how to manipulate our environment to gain more range of motion, maybe through a certain exercise, whether we elevate a leg on a lunge or a split squat. Also, it's changed up some cueing, maybe on some exercises like cueing to lengthen under load, to feel your body elongate, feel your body stretch, like those types of things. That's probably the biggest changes that we made through it.
Cool. That's like all the thing I kind of want to ask about, like fascia. So next thing I want to talk about like in-season training versus like off-season training. I know like train a lot of athletes, right? Like
Yes.
hockey, football. I'm sorry, hockey, basketball, and like can't remember.
Yeah, it's hockey and basketball, the primary sports I work with. But throughout my career, I mean, I've worked with everybody: field hockey, lacrosse, soccer, baseballs, tennis, like you name it. I've experienced with a lot of different sports. But when it comes to in-season training, the philosophy that I kind of have is to do the opposite of what happens within the sport. And I've taken that approach and that mindset because my first and foremost goal of my philosophy, like when we look at training, is to reduce the chance of injury. Performance is my second goal. The way I look at things, you can't get better if you're hurt. So we have to look at things from a mindset of that approach of making sure that we can keep our athletes as healthy as possible so that we can perform on the court or the ice or wherever the field of play that we're looking to, that we compete on. Because it doesn't matter if like if you have a 40-inch vertical jump, but you always get hurt, or if you can squat 400 pounds, but you always get hurt. Like, doesn't matter, right? So we need to keep our athletes healthy. So when we talk about in-season training, it tends to be do the opposite of the sport. So in the sport, in season tends to be high volume, low load because it's just your body weight, and low amplitude, meaning low range of motion. So when we're in season and we're training in the gym, we're going to do low volume activity, right? Because we're not going to tank their energy. We don't want to steal their energy. Second thing is we want to do high load, emphasize loading, so that we can keep motor unit recruitment high. We can keep our strength high, which is going to be a precursor for speed and power. And then the third thing is we want to emphasize range of motion through all of our exercise and through all of our movements to keep our mobility in place. Because if we start to lose mobility, then we can start to increase at risk for some injuries.
So it's like what you just said is like full range of motion, heavy lifting, right?
To a degree, yeah. It all depends, so it's not every exercise is going to be heavy. You know what I mean? Our key exercises will, but also it's going to depend on what the game schedule looks like. Did we travel? All those factors are going to play a role and determine the level of load.
So I heard from another podcast, like you program the athlete to like get stronger at the end of the season so they can be at their best when they're like win their like championship, right?
Yes.
So how exactly do this, like in the chaotic like season, and put these kind of training into wherever they can?
Yeah, so what we like to do is we want to make sure that we train consistently. That's probably the first and foremost goal. We want to train consistency, and the rule that I usually look for is to be able to have at least 4 training sessions within 2 weeks. So if that's twice a week, that's great. If it's game schedules don't allow that, maybe it's 3 one week and 1 the following week. We want to be able to get in at least 4, because then what starts to happen is if we train less than 4 times within a 2-week period, what I've noticed is that it becomes harder to get back into a groove with training. I've had to reduce load because they're not familiar with the exercise because we haven't done them in a while. Then I'm at an increased risk of maybe soreness because they haven't done it in a while. But when we can train twice, like consistently a week, or at least 4 times within a 2-week period, we tend to make sure that we can continue our consistency, that we continue to load to a point where we can maintain. Sorry, I don't like to use the word maintain, but incrementally increase our ability to produce force. And the way we would do that is, one way you can do it is just putting load on the bar and being able to measure that. I'm going to focus primarily on the lower body because that tends to be the most important when it comes to most sporting activities. But the other thing that we do is we have velocity-based trackers so that we can track their velocity in the software that we have access to. Creates an algorithm, has an algorithm with it, so it allows them to determine what their 1RM is. So now we don't always have to load with extra weight to make sure that we're getting stronger. Or the way you should look at it too is you're maintaining motor unit recruitment. If you're maintaining motor unit recruitment, you're maintaining your ability to produce force or increasing your ability to produce force. Those are things that we're really looking at. And so it's a long process to be able to do those things. But we want to make sure we tell all of our athletes that, listen, when we're training, the goal is to continually get better in season. I don't want you to have the mindset we're going to maintain. If you have the mindset we're going to maintain, you're going to lose, right? And if we lose, then we're going to lose qualities that are going to be the most important at the end of the year, which is our speed and our power. And we can measure that through vertical jumps. And it routinely happens every year. Near the end of the season, kids will hit PRs and jumps, or at least hit their best for what they were, or they're within 90% of their best, which is exactly where we want to be. We don't want to see large drop-offs in speed and power of those qualities throughout the year, because we want to be at our best physically at the end of the year.
Cool. So, go back to like in-season training, and there's probably there's gonna be like a lot of games, probably like back to back or back to back to back, and you are able to put these training into like during the season. So does that mean like the off-season training volume will be very high?
Yes. So when we train in the off season, my goal when we train is to increase the body's ability to tolerate stress, right? And so stress is stress. Stress can be physical, stress can be emotional, stress can be financial, like stress can be social. There's so many different types of stressors. And when your body experiences stress, it has the same physiological effects over and over and over again. And so what we want to do is we understand when we're in a season, there's lots of stressors. There's school, because I work in college. There's school as a stressor. Practice, there's physical stressor. Training's physical stressor. Competing is a stressor too. So we have all of these stresses being placed upon the body in season. So in the off season, if we do the minimal amount, you're not increasing your body to tolerate stress at all. Right. So what we want to do is make sure that we gradually increase the amount of training volume that we do over the course of the off season to the point where we're ready to handle what's going to be experienced during practice. And so with the NCAA model, the way we look at things is when you're in season, you have 20 hours of physical activity that you can do. Well, we hardly ever touch that. Typically, it's anywhere from like 12 to 14 hours of physical volume over the course of a week. When we're in our preseason period, the NCAA allows us 8 hours of physical activity. So even if you go from 8 to 12, that's a large jump. So what I look at in our off season is when we train throughout a week, we need to be able to be ready to be able to handle close to 8 to 9 hours of physical activity, so that when we start to practice, we can handle those volumes so we can actually get better at games. And then we should be physically ready. But we want to make sure if we're only training 3 times a week for 3 hours a week, that's not going to get us ready to handle 8 hours. You know what I mean? So we want to make sure, like when we start our early off season, which we just kind of finished up, we're training. Our training sessions they started at 4 45-minute sessions. Then over the last 2 weeks, they're up to an hour. Then when we hit the summer, they'll probably jump to an hour and 10, an hour and 15 minutes. Then after that, they'll push closer to hour and 20, hour and a half minute sessions. So now we're gradually increasing the volume because we want to increase that capacity of the body to be able to handle volume and handle stress.
So how long would the in-season training session be?
Early on, it's typically probably close to 40, 45 minutes. And then when we're getting near the end of our season and we're tapering, it's probably close to 20 to 25 minutes.
So is it kind of like wave loading?
No, not necessarily. Wave loading is just like a loading technique that you would use. Within maybe a certain exercise, you would use some wave loading, whether it be a 6-1 or a 3-2-1. No, but we'll often do. Have you ever been exposed to Easy Strength by Pavel and Dan John? It's a good book.
Not really.
I don't know when it came out, but we kind of use the rule or premise of for our heavier exercises, our key indicator exercises, of doing no more than 10 reps. So, and it'll be above 80% load, and we kind of stick to that formula. So we can break it up into 2 sets of 5. We can do 4 sets of 2, 3 sets of 3. So the volume is low, but allows our intensity and our loads to stay relatively high. And then we might do a little bit more higher volume work for maybe auxiliary work or assistance work or upper body work. But like our key lower body movements tends to be no more than 10 reps.
Got it.
But we could do clusters too, is what I like to do, where we might go a warm-up set of 3, a build-up set of 3, and then we do a 3x1. So 1 racket 1 racket 1. So it allows us to maintain higher quality of efforts with a little interset rest occurring.
Okay, got it. So next thing I want to talk about is like I heard the podcast you did with like Jake Anderson.
Okay.
And you
that was a couple years.
Yeah, and I think it's like 2 years ago or last year.
Yeah, it was a while ago. It was dead during COVID. I know that.
So, and you talk about like quadrant system, right?
Oh yeah.
So, what's the difference between what you just mentioned?
I don't think there really is a difference, right? And so when we look at quadrants or a high-low type principle where we have high intensity on one axis, or volume on one axis and intensity on another axis, we've created 4 different quadrants. So quadrant 1 would be low volume and low intensity. Those are off days, right? And then quadrant 2 is going to be high volume, low intensity. In season, we rarely will ever hit those kind of days where we just do high volume, unless we're like maybe we don't play a game for a while, right? Where it's just a lot of volume and not a lot of like intensity. Quadrant 3 is low volume, high intensity. This is probably the majority of what weight room stuff is going to be, right? Because we're not going to do a lot of volume, but the intensity or the intent is going to be fairly high. Or even in practice, this is where we want to be, because we want to make sure that we are practicing at the pace that we want to be able to play and perform at. So it should be competing, it should be challenging, and it should be at a high pace in which we want to play. And then quadrant 4 is high volume and high intensity, which is typically where your games are going to be, right? And so the way we describe that to coaches and to our athletes is we can't live in quadrant 4 all the time, that we want to be able to fluctuate between different quadrants. We may live between quadrant 3, quadrant 4, quadrant 1 within a week if we're playing games. In the off season, we may fluctuate, like that's going to be probably more quadrant 4 work, right? We may fluctuate between quadrant 2, 3, and then 4, and then with rest days, quadrant 1 days too.
Cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure, man. Like easy way to let everybody know what's quadrant system. That was cool.
Yeah.
So I know you like train hockey player, and I also train like hockey player.
Oh, you do? Good for you.
So, what do you think like the hockey is different from other sports?
Why do we think hockey is different than other sports? Because the velocities that they hit are going to be completely different, right? You're on a frictionless surface, right? You're on ice, and then you're on a 1-inch piece of steel, and you can hit up to speeds like 40 to 60 miles an hour. Like a lot of other sports can never hit those levels of velocity. So their tissues need to be prepared to handle those velocities, because those velocities don't happen in the weight room, right? No matter what you do, you're not going to hit velocities like that in the weight room. You got to be able to sprint, right? You got to be able to sprint. You got to be able to do those types of things to expose their tissue to be able to handle stress. And then the other thing with hockey that requires, every sport requires a lot of qualities, but hockey requires so many qualities. So you need to have a high aerobic capacity. You need to be fast. You need to be explosive. You need to be powerful. You need to be strong. You need to have balance. You need to be able to coordinate, because you're on a 1-inch piece of steel handling an object away that's like 3 feet away from you, while people are trying to hit you and knock you over. Yeah. It's a very challenging sport, and then you're doing something that's not really natural to the human body. Like the skating isn't the best thing for your body.
Yeah.
Because it's a different type of gait, right? And so it's not like sprinting. It's going to be much more. It occurs much more in the frontal and transverse plane.
Yeah.
So it's very challenging.
So how would you program the training for a hockey player?
At what point of the year?
Say off season.
And so in the off season, the good thing about the way our model works is that typically we don't have access to ice, which is a great way to be able to train. Because if you basketball is like a different scenario, right? So basketball, you always have access to a court, right? You can always play basketball. And so basketball players hardly ever get that time off where they can just dedicate themselves towards training. You're always kind of almost competing with skill work that's occurring at the same time. So it doesn't always lend to the best model or best structure for you to be able to improve your physical capacity. But I think what we can do in hockey, because we don't have access to ice, it allows us to dedicate more time towards improving our athletic development. And so that's what we look at when it comes down to training. Like I said before, we want to reduce the chance of injury, so we want to make sure our athletes move well. And then second, we want to make sure that we can improve all of their athletic capabilities. And it's depending on the time of the off season, it's all going to be different. So we might do early in the off season, we might not emphasize speed and power that much. We might touch on it. So I might say it's like 5% of our training volume or 7% of our training volume, where 30% is going to be geared towards hypertrophy and strength. And then maybe 20% is going to be geared towards some aerobic capacity. But then as we get closer and closer to the season, we might shift gears, where now 20% of what we do is going to be sprinting and jumping and power-based stuff. Strength comes down to 20%. And then our alactic capacity type work is going to start to increase as we get closer to the season. So we're always training multiple qualities within the system and model that I like to use. But the amount of time and volume that we dedicate towards any one quality will change and will undulate throughout the course of the off season. So I've learned that if we want to improve an athlete's speed, obviously we want to do speed probably closer to the season, but we got to teach them how to be fast earlier in the season, so that when we start to do early in the off season, so that when we do our reps later in the off season, they can be at a higher quality. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So some people will say oh, we don't need to do power till later. But if they don't know how you want them to produce power, you don't know how to teach that, you haven't taught them how to jump, how to land, all those types of things, then when you start to do those reps later, then you're wasting time learning it, right? So at least teach them with low volume earlier in the off season, and then progress it to higher volumes when the time is right. But we always want to keep a thread of every quality throughout the off season. The volumes are just going to be different.
How about the thing you just mentioned about the gait cycle is different, and there's a lot of not really sprinting, but a lot of transverse plane, that kind of movement.
Yep. So what we want to do is obviously hockey tends to be a lot more frontal plane and transverse plane dominant. That doesn't mean that's going to constitute the majority of our training. Early in the off season, a lot of our training will be, sagittal plane based. because we want to make sure that we move well through that plane, so we understand how to use our muscles the right way and how to sense and feel and tension those fascial chains. And then as we get closer and closer to the season, we'll start to introduce much more frontal plane activity so that we can prepare those tissues to be able to handle that. Because again, everything comes down to how you look at things. And so if I look at things from a perspective where we want to reduce the chance of injury first and foremost, we want to make sure we move well first. Then we got to make sure we move often. And then we got to make sure we do that, move fast after that. And then we want to make sure, can we move fast over and over and over again in the positions that they want to be able to do things. So that's how we kind of look at things, is we want to make sure that we will introduce more frontal plane activity, more transverse plane activity. But a lot of it comes down to, do you understand how to reduce and produce force first in the sagittal plane? And then we'll start to progress that into frontal plane activities, into transverse plane activities, so that they can understand how to be more efficient with how they absorb force, but also how they produce force.
Got it.
It's just layering, really. So we teach them really fundamental things, and then layer complexity on top of that, layer velocity, layer speed, all on top of that. But everything comes back down to, can you get into the right positions to be able to move optimally and move efficiently, right? Because we don't want to compensate. We don't want to create compensations within our movement patterns. We want to make sure that we can move, like I said before, we want to move well first and foremost, and then we will start to load on top of that.
Cool. Last thing, and I'm gonna let you go, okay?
Okay.
You talk about like move well a lot today. Is there like a movement screen for you, or like anything you're gonna do before you train? Any tests before you like train your athlete?
Yeah, good question. So for years I did the functional movement screen, and it never really changed what we did. It was a great way for me, honestly. Like, it was a great way for me to first look at our athletes and to be able to see how well they moved, where their mobility and stability deficiencies were, and then it allowed. I think what it did, it helped our athletes start to understand the value of the things that we would do within a warm-up too, because some of the things were very similar in how we did them to try to improve their movement quality. But most recently, I started to progress it's a screen or an assessment called the Athletic Ability Assessment. And it just introduces load, and it's a little bit more dynamic and ballistic activities into what we screen. So it's an overhead squat with a bar. It's a single leg squat for reps. It's a walking lunge with a bar. It's a forearm plank. It's a side bridge for time. And then you can start to see like where deficiencies may start to happen under load, which is so important for sports. A lateral bound, a single leg hop and land. And those are going to be much more qualitative based. But it's scored just like the FMS 3-2-1-0 if you get a pain. So it allows me to at least get a first glimpse of what an incoming athlete looks like. And then I can design a program around that. In reality, the majority, like our intro program, is pretty much the same for a lot of people, but we might tinker here and there based on any kind of orthopedic concerns that they might have had before. Or we can say, hey, you need extra work in this area. You need extra work in your mobility. You need extra work in your T-spine mobility based on what we saw here and there.
So you used FMS before. Why don't you use like SFMA?
Because I don't have the time to do the SFMA. Like, it's like if I've got X amount of athletes coming in and I only have them for an hour, I don't have time to be able to do all the breakouts with every single person. It just doesn't work that way. Logistics rule in college athletics. So idealism is great, but idealism and doing like the best things aren't always the most user-friendly things. So logistics have to win. So if there's things that are going to be much more logical for me to implement within the time constraints that I have, I got to be able to do those things. And then the other thing too is I think everything you do is screening. Like when I watch our athletes move, when I watch them walk, like that's an always opportunities to be able to teach and look at how they move.
Cool. So that's like all the questions I have for today. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you very much.
Really love it. I learned a lot.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hopefully all the listeners did too.
Yeah. There's a lot of coaches I did the podcast before. They recommend me to like do a podcast with you.
Oh, did they really?
Yeah, and just like there's a listener downstairs just said you're a legend. They said
Oh,
the
yeah.
same thing.
Oh, that was one of my former basketball players at Quinnipiac.
Oh,
Yeah, that's
cool.
it. Yeah, that's awesome. It was nice to meet you, Eric.
Yeah, nice to meet you too, Coach.
Okay.
So if there's like coaches or like athletes are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
They can follow me on Instagram, B Patel 515, Twitter, same handle. I think I have. That was my friend, Jim. I also have a website, coachbpatel.com. I think I have in my bio on Instagram my link tree, which is links to every access. But yeah, great way to reach out. I'll do consults, just like things like this where I can try to help coaches get better. But yeah, that's probably the best way.
So really love the content today, and I'm gonna probably gonna go hear it like two or three times.
Is this recorded? Is that how it works? I've never really done an Instagram live.
When it finishes, it's gonna go on my Instagram page, and I'm gonna download that and put it on YouTube like next week.
Okay, cool. Just let me know when, and I can share on my info, on my stuff.
Okay. And probably can we schedule like a second episode on this?
Oh, you
really
want to do another one?
Yeah, really love it.
Sure. If it's if we get some good publicity and good information out of it, for sure.
Okay. Thanks. Appreciate it, man.
You got it. Be good.
See you. Have a nice day.
You too.